Hi everyone, hope you guys are all having a great day today. In today's video, I'm going to cover the whole entire market in terms of the S&P 500, Dow Jones, Nasdaq, so on and so forth. Plus, I'm going to cover the economic calendar, economic news, 10-year treasury, and crude oil. So hopefully you guys like the video. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. If you do, consider dropping a like. It does help the channel, so thank you so much for that. Before I break down in terms of support levels, resistance levels, price actions, how the market's going to be moving, I'm going to go over the economic news. In terms of tomorrow, so again, the projections I give is a little bit more further out within like weeks, months kind of stuff, but more specifically for tomorrow. And at the same time, in terms of economic news, I tend to give only for the next day. So Monday, April 29th, there's nothing coming out. But the one thing to watch out for, which kind of contradicts what I said earlier, is for this week, we have the FOMC interest rate decision in terms of Fed meetings. And then we have Jerome Powell speaking as well within that same day. So that is on Wednesday, May 1st of 2024. Plus, we have earnings to look out for. We have AMD, I believe, this week coming up, and Apple coming up in terms of earnings this week. And within this whole entire time, one thing to note is we have a bunch of earnings coming out, which will affect the markets in terms of movement. For example, NVIDIA as well, which is a big heavy hitter. And I believe that is towards the end of May a little bit for the most part. So those things will tend to move the markets, as we saw with Apple and not Apple, but with Google and Microsoft. That moved the market as well, even though we had the PCE numbers that came out before. So for example, we have the PCE numbers, and the Fed looks at the core PCE numbers specifically, which has the energy and food taken out of it, and that we saw previously was at 2.8%, and they were expecting 2.7%, but we got 2.8%. So it was an increase, but technically flatlined. Plus, combined with earnings that was pretty much beats throughout for in terms of Google and Microsoft, so that pretty much carried the markets as well at the same time. So that's the reason why we didn't see much of a hit overall for the most part. But it's going to be interesting for sure in terms of how the market will react based off the meetings that we're going to see on Wednesday. So that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of the 10-year treasury, we're at 4.663%. That's again the US 10-year treasury. Again, that is important because the higher it goes up, the less money that goes into the stock market in general, because this is a more safer risk or safer return for less risk, right? In terms of crude oil, we're at $83.27 per barrel. And again, that is a big factor in terms of energy, in terms of inflation numbers, because that was a big factor in terms of CPI numbers that came out. In terms of analysis, so I'm going to go over the Dow Jones because it kind of goes against the S&P and Nasdaq. Again, I'm going to be looking at the SPY, which is an ETF for the S&P 500, and QQQ, which is an ETF for the Nasdaq, just compressed numbers and all stuff. If we look at the 5-year chart for the Dow Jones, we're sitting at 38,239 points. And for the time being, right now, the 5-year chart MACD line is pointing to the downside. The 1-year chart, it was going to downside / bearish movement, then was going back down again, but went straight up. And you would think that it's going to be going up potentially, right? So it almost looked like it did bounce off the upward trend support level right about here that we saw a bunch of times bounce off of. Hasn't quite gone to it yet. And the S&P and Nasdaq looks like they're going to the upside, especially with combined with earnings. And I think the Fed interest rates, they're just going to be pretty much neutral, where it still leaves it up to open to one interest rate cut. And I think that will satisfy the market for the time being right now if they just keep it open. So that Fed meeting, I don't think there's going to be much reaction. More that earnings will just carry us, right? With combined inflation numbers overall, like inflation actually helps earnings overall, right? Because technically they're bringing in more money, and their margins tend to hypothetically should shrink, but with margins increasing still somehow, relatively speaking, the inflation numbers are helping their earnings to go up, if that makes sense. So yeah, so in terms of the 6 month for the Dow Jones, this is where it gets interesting. It's in the bearish movement, and it looks like it's going to arch back down to the bearish movement, right? So downside coming in for the most part. The last red candle was a red candle. Then we look at the 3-month chart, and it's in the bullish movement, but it looks like it's about to cross over to the bearish movement at one point. Again, not guaranteed, but it seems like the Dow Jones is different than the S&P and Nasdaq. Again, it is a smaller sample size because it's only 30, I believe. So then we have the 1-month chart, and it is bullish movement, but it looks like it's arching down to the bearish movement once again as well. So if we were to come down to the upward trend support level, hypothetically, we'd be looking around the ballpark, though, the ballpark of about 37,445 points. Again, that's for the Dow Jones. But then if we look at the Nasdaq, so I'm going to look at QQQ, which is an ETF in the Nasdaq. So we have this movement right about now, 5-year chart. We are in the bearish movement, right? But we had a major green candle technically, but it doesn't matter either way. Still bearish movement pointing to the downside. The 1-year chart looks like it's about to arch down. So technically, in terms of more shorter term versus the 5-year chart, it looks like we're about to bounce back up. And personally, in my opinion, I think so, given that I think the Fed will give more of a neutral, yeah, we're still looking at potentially one interest rate cut. They're not going to say that directly, but essentially point to like yes kind of way, and combined with earnings and like all these earnings coming up in terms of big heavy hitters, I think they're going to be positive. So that's going to project us to the upside for the time being. And if you look at the 6-month chart, yeah, it's in the bullish movement right now, and it looks like it's going to be in the bearish, but I think this is still going to reverse to the upside regardless. That's the 6-month chart. The 3-month chart is in the bearish movement. Again, I still think it's going to go to the upside regardless. Again, this is just all my opinion, so please do your own due diligence and research before buying and selling. And then this is in the bearish movement. So technically in the short term, it looks like we're headed to the downside. If you look at just the technicals, short term wise, we're heading to the downside. Technically long term side as well to the downside. But I think combined with the Fed meeting on Wednesday, plus earnings, we have AMD and Apple this week as well. Unless, for example, Apple's towards the end of the week, unless Apple's just horrendous, somehow, not horrendous, just doesn't do anything, and then the market's kind of closed down towards the end of the week, we could probably actually end up heading down. But if you're optimistic for the earnings from what we've been seeing so far in the tech sector, and you think it's just going to continue to upside based off that, which I think that's what's going to happen. Again, just my opinion. Then I think we're just going to reverse the upside regardless. And I think we've not necessarily seen the bottom, but seen the bottom for the short term right now, and then heading up until some bad news happens, or unless the Fed meeting is horrendous actually, and they're saying, yeah, we're not going to cut interest rates, which technically they could because the PCE number hasn't come down, and the PCE number is the Fed's more specific calculation of what they believe interest rate is at. So it's more precise than the CPI. So given that, technically, what they should really do is technically say, yeah, there's not going to be interest rate cut. And if they do say that, then I think, in my opinion, the markets will head down, regardless of the earnings for this week, right? And it will be after, yeah. So it depends. It all depends on how the Fed speaks. Technically, they should be saying that, but I don't think they want to bring down the markets that drastic. So I don't think they'll say that. I think they'll just leave it open and saying we're looking at the data the whole entire time, like what they've always been saying. And then if we look at actually I'm going to give the levels for QQQ, and then I'm going to go over the SPY. So in terms of QQQ, if we were to go to the upside first, and then I'll cover the downside, we did have the horizontal resistance level at about $530 or $430 price point. We're currently sitting at 431, and did have some trouble passing it, but essentially passed it. Then the next level was about 432 to 433, and we're still pretty much going to have issues passing it potentially. But ultimately, if we do going up to the upside with AMD, Fed meeting, and then Apple and all stuff, and other big heavy hitters, then we're essentially, I think in my opinion, heading to this upward trend support level that we've bounced off it as support, but at the same time hit it as resistance too as well. So I think we're going to hit it as resistance going up to the upside. But before we do that, I think we have quite a bit. Okay, yeah. So either way, so we have about resistance at the 434 as well. So it's a bunch of resistance levels going to the upside, but we're essentially going to end up getting between the channels. So between 433, 434, all the way to 438, $439 price point in terms of channel, and then have issues on the upward trend resistance / support level at the 400. It's saying 437 right now, mid 437, but when I checked, it was about 436. But either way, I could be wrong. But essentially, having issues about 438, 437, 439, staying within that channel. Ultimately, I guess 440 to keep it clean, because obviously going to get close to that 440, and then either trickle down, depending on how fast it hits it, though. That's the only problem. Because if it hits it before the meeting, and then it would be capped at the 440, and then start trickling down based off what they say, or it could be a catalyst and we could start hitting this downward trend resistance line as well within later in the week. But I'll assess it day by day. For the time being, that's going to be just jumping it too far along, because we still need some catalysts and narratives to see how the market reacts. But essentially 432, 433 is the first level. Then we're looking at basically 437, 438, 439. Naturally, I think it'll just test the 440 anyway, regardless, because it's a clean number. And then those are the high levels. Now, in terms of the down levels, in terms of support levels, we're looking at 430. That's going to act as support, in my opinion, just because it's hard to break it / it's acted as support in the past, right? We saw right about here, but 430. And then if we head to the downside, which I don't believe we will too much in a way, like obviously we still head down to the downside, but we'll see support, I guess, around the 426, just because based off moving average, but most likely around the actual support level, which is 424, 425, and then trickle down to the low 420. I do not think we're going to break 420, in my opinion, unless some major bad news happens, because there is still tensions, I guess, in the Middle East. But at the same time, I don't foresee anything bad happening just because of the catalyst of earnings. And I think the Feds is going to keep it neutral, where they're going to leave it open for one interest rate cut again. So because of that, I don't see us going lower than 420. If we do end up dropping lower overall, then obviously I'll give the lower levels. But for the most part, I think 420 would be the lowest we would see. So again, To the downside, we're looking at 430. Then from 430 to 424, 425. Obviously, there's support levels between those levels, but still for the most part. And then trickle down to the low 420s, ultimately hitting 420, the lowest in my opinion, again, before we bounce up to the upside potentially if there's some good catalyst and all that stuff. Now to the SPY, which is the ETF for the S&P 500. We have the 5-year chart showing the same thing pretty much as the Nasdaq. So in the bearish movement right now, the 1-year chart, I believe it's arching just like the Nasdaq, arching to the upside. So still bearish movement, but looking to cross over to the bullish movement, which potentially, again, I think carried with earnings and all stuff will happen potentially. And then the 6-month is showing bullish movement, but not really arching to the bearish movement. And then the 3-month is in the bearish movement, not really arching to the bullish movement. And then in terms of the 1 month, it's in the bearish, but not really, but it somewhat is arching to a bullish movement, but not really that strong, to be honest. It could easily drop down still. So somewhat mixed reviews. I think it's basically, for the most part, earnings is just going to move everything. Earnings and then the Fed meeting. So that's what we're anticipating for Wednesday. Again, there's nothing really on the calendar for tomorrow. The only thing I could see that for the most part is 3-month bill auctions, Dallas Fed Manufacturing Index, 6-month bill auctions, and then Treasury refunding finance estimates. That's all happening for tomorrow. I probably should have read that earlier. Sorry about that. Hopefully you guys still paid attention the whole entire time. And then in terms of the movements that we're looking at going to the 3-month, so we see we have a downward trend resistance line. For the SPY, I think we will hit it personally, maybe even before the Fed meeting. But if we do head up to the upside, we had the original $510 price point, or not $500, 10 point, but we're sitting at $508.26 right now. To the upside, we have resistance at the $510, which I think will still stop us for the time being. And then we head to 511 mid, and then ultimately hitting this downward trend resistance line, depending on when we hit it, but it's looking at $13, give or take. Now, I think, personally, the way this week will go, I think we're going to pass 513 and essentially going to the next level, which would be about mid, when I checked it, mid 515, maybe 514, give or take, but it was predominantly mid $515. And that's the upside. Now to the downside, if we were to come down, I think we'll hit a bunch of support levels where we just won't drop that much. The first level was pretty much about the $504, $503. Obviously, yes, for the 505, we'll hit it. We'll act as support because we have 2 moving averages meeting. But ultimately, I think if we were to head down and just to kind of solidify a little bit again to start heading back to the upside, if that's what the narrative will happen with the earnings and meeting, then it's about the $503, $504 price point. And then ultimately, if it does break that level, we're heading back down to the $501 and $500 clean, maybe hitting the high $499. I just don't see us going lower than that. Again, given the earnings and the Fed meeting. Until the Fed meeting, if it's really bad, then we could start trickling down. I don't anticipate something bad happening because the market is anticipating an interest rate cut, the increase from the PCE number, or what was it? Yeah, I believe it was from the PCE number. And then at the same time, I do think they're just going to stay neutral, leaving it open. And if they leave it open, then the market will be satisfied, in my opinion. But hopefully you guys like the video. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. If you do, consider dropping a like. It does help the channel, so thank you so much for that. And I do post these daily, so if you want to be notified when I do upload them again, so consider subscribing so you'll be notified when I do upload the next video. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Take care. Peace.